Okay. All right. So I guess let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Facebook Live event. I'm Greg Ayotte, Director of Consumer Services with the Brain Injury Association of America. And today we're going to be talking about advocacy. So just some, I don't know what to call them, reminders to start. So obviously we're not going to cover every possible scenario under advocacy. We're going to focus on kind of two main areas. One is kind of this individual or self advocacy, as I was taught this morning, and more the bigger picture, like legislative advocacy, and just talk about some of the basics of how to get started and what to do and tips for being an advocate. And we're lucky to have with us Heather Maddie. Heather is a person with a brain injury. She's a certified brain injury specialist. She's been doing advocacy for years in her home state of Kansas. Full disclosure, she also works part-time for the Brain Injury Association of America. She helps to respond to the requests that come in through our 800 line and our website. Heather, introduce yourself to folks. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Heather. I started my advocacy back in college. I was working for a person who had a physical disability, and she was very involved in advocacy. That was part in college. I was doing um, my work on the campus, and that's how I got to meet her. And Kathy was very involved in getting the American with Disabilities Act in progress. She did a lot of work with people on that. And she also started her own Center for Independent Living. And that was back in the day before there was the assistive technology. So I was her note taker. So I learned a lot of the parts of advocacy from her.
Okay.
And then I worked at a Center for Independent Living in Pennsylvania, and that was part of my job doing the advocacy as well.
Yes, you've had a very varied experience in your advocacy work, and like I said, I've been doing it in a bunch of different ways. I was going to start kind of talking about because one of the questions that we get fairly regularly on the uh, through NBIC is a question about kind of how can I help my friend, my family member, my loved one kind of get the services that they need. And so they call looking for an advocate, right? They call saying, I need an advocate to help kind of get some services. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of just that, what that process might look like, kind of what the tips are for families who kind of want to help, what they can do to be that advocate. Do you have any tips for like family members or friends that are looking to help kind of connect people with services or find the right services?
Yes, there's individual advocacy is when you're helping another person to get their exact needs met, and there's a lot of steps to it. There's different types of advocacy at the individual level. One of the big ones we see is to help them get the services they need,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be in different levels. Like, for example, like um, appealing an insurance decision is a big one we see from time to time again. Another one is to help them get the exact needs they're getting that they're not getting from the program they're involved in. And there's several steps in that. One thing is doing your research. That's a really important thing with that. You can make calls to the different programs to find out their criteria, um, and with and to make other calls to the Centers for Independent Living or other programs that can give you, because each state has different, this is one of the big things. Each state and each programs have different criteria and different forms of payment, so that makes a difference too.
Yep.
But the number one thing I tell people is patience. That's a hard thing for people to do.
Yes.
And when you're talking to the people about the needs, it's being assertive but not aggressive. And for some
Right.
people, that's very difficult because of their frustration
Yeah.
tolerance.
Yeah.
But the one thing is research is finding out, like for example, if you want to do appeal for insurance, because they're saying you only get 3 weeks. Um, you a lot of times it's you calling the insurance company and talking to the insurance system and getting documentation. That's a huge thing that's needed, like the documentation of what the person's needs are, the documentation from getting information about how to do the appeal. And once you get that started, it's getting all the paperwork in. And now, with a lot of places, things are done through computers,
Yeah.
which what help for a lot of people, it helps to have them actually um, get it in paper. That helps a lot just to have the document right in front of you.
Yep.
The other part of that is writing your own notes, writing a script of what you want to say when you're talking to the companies, questions you need to ask. That's really important when you're helping that person with the advocacy.
True. So I think you hit on a couple of important points. One, especially that about doing the research about when if it's a question of insurance coverage, like calling the insurance company to find out what are the covered benefits, what might be available, what is the appeals process, how do you appeal? Because there can be several levels to the appeals process. If you're dealing with a state insurance, like a Medicaid type insurance, I always tell folks, like when you are appealing a decision, you got to find the person that has the authority to say yes.
Right.
When you call that 800 number for the state Medicaid, they don't have the authority to say yes. They can give you information about what the appeals process is and what could be covered, but you got to find the person that has the authority to say yes. And that's where that being polite but persistent is what I call it. But you talked about, right, being, you don't need to be aggressive, but you need to be persistent, that you're going to consistently call to ask questions, to ask, what do I need to do? What are the next steps? Send me that.
And with Medicaid, for example, it's very complicated because there's different, especially now that a lot of the states have gone to managed care organizations.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you need to start it, but then you can research and look, like for example, in Kansas, there's a Kansas Disability and Aging and Disability Services, and a lot of them have aging and disability resource centers, and that's a place to go to, and they would be able to tell you which is the particular person. But that even with the MCO, if you're not aware who's the person you need to talk to.
Yes. So one of the other things that we see a lot with is the challenge of finding the right service that's near you, right? So if it's something a little more specialized, there may not be a program that's near you that's a network, that's covered, or what it might be. And so one of the other kind of advocacy tips that I also wanted to talk about was the idea of these single case agreements.
Yeah.
So if you have a specialized service that you need that is clinically appropriate and it's not available in your network of care, and there's another program, maybe it's in a neighboring state, maybe it's 2 counties over, but it's just not in their network, you can work with that provider and your insurance coverage to see if they would do what's called a single case agreement.
Correct. And that's the important, is talk to the provider first.
Yes, right.
To make sure that program will do a single case agreement with the insurance company.
Not everybody will do it, right?
Right. But there are several that will, and just find out from that program what is needed to do that agreement.
So for those who may not know, so the single case agreement, what that basically is the program will do an agreement with the funding source for that case. They don't become an in-network provider. They're not becoming part of that network. But for this case, they will say, okay, we will provide that service. We agree with the funding source to pay for it. It is not something that most funding sources will offer. Like you need to ask for it. They won't say, oh, well, you might be able to do that. That won't happen.
An important part of that too is getting, like, a lot of insurance will want proof that they cannot be accepted at that program, even they'll want a refusal of care from a program to get that single case agreement.
Right. They'll look
so that's for documentation. You make sure you get that they were not accepted at that program, or that program does not meet their level of care, and list the reasons why.
Right. So that documentation about why the in-network program is not most clinically appropriate, the other program would be. So so we've had a few questions come in. It's hard to answer nationally. One of the questions is, are there ways for caretakers to get financial assistance to help with their responsibilities? Like that really very
That's different from state to state.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to say already. There are some states that allow caregivers to get paid, and there's others that do not.
Right.
And one of the exceptions for a lot of the states is if you're in a rural area, but unfortunately, often they prefer to have someone else. Some people have fundraised to get the money to help with all of this, but that's a hard question because it's a state by state basis.
We're seeing more states are making exceptions, and more states are making respite care funds available to larger groups. But we're talking about kind of ongoing, kind of in-home care and supports that vary so much from state to state as to what might be available or allowed. So that's a hard one to answer. But I wanted to address it. That is a common question that we get through our helpline. I would say for those, typically what I would tell somebody is certainly talking to their local Center for Independent Living, talking to their local Brain Injury Association office, talking to their local Aging and Disability resource, whatever agency or organization is there to kind of help connect people with whatever resources are there. Reach out, start doing research, try to find out what might be available. Because it definitely can vary a lot from state to state. So, talked a little bit about the idea of this advocacy and the importance of doing research, kind of being polite but persistent, kind of documentation, the importance of figuring out care and services. One of the other kind of topics or issues I wanted to touch on too around the advocacy part is that you can do everything right and it's still not end up getting that. It's not necessarily a reflection of something you did wrong. If the service is not available, if there's just nothing there, then you have to start to figure out what's the least bad option, right? What's the most appropriate out of the resources I have available to work with. And that's where talking to the Brain Injury Association in your state, giving us a call, finding a support group and talking to other family members could be helpful about programs or providers or groups that they found to be useful, trying to figure out what others have done.
And an example of that, there was a situation with a person who was in a program that was not appropriate for them. They tried and tried. And then what happened is when they were at this other program, they started declining. Mm-hmm. And they got the proof of that. And sometimes it takes something like that. Sometimes the first time it doesn't work, and it's persistence.
Yes.
And once they got that, then it took a couple months, and they wish it would have been sooner. But sometimes that's just how the system works. And that's where the persistence and as well as the patience.
That's a really good point. So the importance of persistence, because a lot of people sometimes I get this. A lot of people think I only have one shot. If I make this referral and get the client, I'll never get in that program. I'm like, no. So, with brain injury, because it's such a change, things change, that you can get denied and 3 weeks later do another referral and get approved because it's a different, you're presenting differently. Maybe the medication's kicked in and you're a little more stable, whatever it might be, things change. So
and another thing with that is state insurance departments have a medical appeal. All the states have a medical appeal program. So that's also a really important, for example, there was a person that they were going to discharge after 3 weeks that was not ready to go. So they contacted the medical appeal department, the state insurance department, and they looked it over and said, oh no, he's not ready to go. So that's another thing that can be helpful for some people.
Yes. So I also wanted to switch gears a little bit. And so there's a lot we can unpack around this question of kind of individual advocacy and working to get services. So I also want to encourage folks that have been there and done it, right? Who have done this, encourage them to somehow stay connected with a support group, with a somewhere in your state to pay it forward, to help the next person figure out, because this is I mean, for somebody new to this, or as families might know, you feel overwhelmed. It's a whole new world. You're learning all this lingo, and as you start to begin to understand it and start to learn how to work within the system, that's really important information to pass on to the next person in line, to the next folks, to be able to pay it forward a little bit. So I'd encourage folks who feel like they learned some things to share it. That's advocacy. Mm-hmm. That's sharing that information, that insight, kind of your experiences, that's advocacy. So it can be as simple as being in a support group and sharing how you appealed and what that process looked like and how you got documentation and what you wrote in the appeal to get approved. Like, that's advocacy. Those are things.
And another big is a lot of states have the TBI advisory councils, and that's involved. Some of them have different, like for example, Kansas has one for the professionals, then they have a subgroup for caregivers and survivors, and that when they get together, that's a big time to share the different ways of you've been able to advocate and what needs done.
Great segue, because that's where I want to head next, is to the question of advocacy. We get both the individual case, right, helping a person, and then bigger picture, right? How do I improve the systems of care? That to a lot of folks feels overwhelming, right? How can I make that difference? It is. It's a big ask. It's a big. So
and it's one thing I've learned through all the years is things don't happen overnight, and that's one thing where the patience comes in hand too. I mean, you'll be on these committees, and and there's going to be differing views, and sometimes that's hard to hear the views that the professionals have or the other people have that are different than yours.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really important, is just to listen to what they are and ask. If you don't understand, ask them a question. Like, I was in a committee once and they were talking about one of the insurance company provider was asking, well, this isn't covered. And I was like, well, then you don't understand brain injury. And you can be blunt about it and then educate them about that. This was about getting assistance filling out paperwork. They didn't understand the difficulty. So it's educating them as well is a big part of this. Educating it may be the managed care organizations, the state, or, even a physician's office, educating them.
Let's talk about that. The ways that you can, so we get that question a lot, right? How can I be an advocate in my state? So I also want to point out, so there's certainly the federal level advocacy. So the Brain Injury Association of America develops our legislative briefs, which you can find on the BIA website. Encourage folks to download that brief, contact their congressional representative, encourage them to support the funding requests that we've made for brain injury at the federal level. So that's a relatively straightforward ask. That's you're sharing what you would like them to fund. as far as federal brain injury programs. So that piece is sharing your story, giving the ask, encouraging them to become a member of the brain injury task force if they're not a task force, and encourage them to understand a little bit more about brain injury. Like I said, by sharing your story, share a little bit about what you know about brain injury in your state, whatever it might be. Then there's the state level part. That's where it gets, I mean, to me, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where programs and policies, and so you can do advocacy legislatively at the state level. And you can also do advocacy programmatically. So there's important, like, not everything is done legislatively at the state level. It can be a policy of the agency that you're pushing to change or improve that doesn't require the legislation to be passed. It requires the policy to be changed.
Correct. And like the policy, that's one thing where the research comes back in, for example, like Kansas and a couple other states have the Home and Community-Based Services Steering Committee, or they have the Committee for In-Home Care, different programs. And that's where the research comes in, which persons are on this committee. And even going to the steering committees and sharing your story. But, and that you can get from talk to the Center for Independent Living, the TBI Advisory Board, because like within the legislation, there's different committees that work on different things. Like there's the Ways and Means that do the finance and the budgeting, and then the committees that just work for like people with disabilities and home and community, and that's a big way to look at it.
Yeah, so it's important to kind of do the research, to reach out to the Brain Injury Association in your state, to the Center for whoever is doing advocacy work around access to care, community support, whatever your passion is. Find out what's being asked for and support it. If you look at it, it's like, well, better than what we have, then support that. It always helps when there's a more unified message. And I always tell folks, it can feel like it's nothing. Like, who am I to contact a representative and share my story and ask them to support this? I'm just one person.
And that's when they hear stories. I'm going to give you an example of a situation with myself.
Yeah.
For years, I mean, it took years, over 10 years, to get this changed. But the earned income limit in Kansas was I think it was $850. So if you made above that, you had to pay the difference. And they had tried that for years and years. And I mean, we all went in, but one day I'm sitting there, I'm like, I don't think they understand, even if you're on disability or if, how much, even Medicaid, you still have bills. And so I said, I made an appointment with several of them and I took my bills. And he looked at me and he's like, I like this because I'm seeing it in writing. They didn't realize how much costs were associated with, that didn't include a lot of the places just look at housing and stuff, but no, you may have co-pays on your medications. You may have to buy things out of your pocket. And they were, and that shocked a lot of them, and it helped them to see with bills that the reality of the situation.
Right. Kind of showing the real world impact of kind of what their program or legislation might be can make a difference. Like you said, it wasn't one meeting where you went in and shared that and they were like, oh, okay, we'll change it. It's multiple meetings over, it can be over multiple years.
And that can be very frustrating, but, and sometimes you think you're not being listened to, but in the back of your mind, you have to tell yourself, I did what I can. I did have that. Several of us met with them, and at least we're getting the ball rolling. Like, I mean, several things that I started working when I moved to Kansas 15 years ago just got passed in the last 5 years. So it's patience and perseverance. And having support is a good thing too, like the support groups. A lot of people in the support groups met together and did that as well. And the advisory board meetings.
Yep. So in folks are looking for ways to get started, right, they can look for a support group to get connected to. I said, look for the Brain Injury Association in their state. What are they asking for? What can I support that they've done the research and the work? They might have some ask. I can support that. I can contact my legislator and do that. I can encourage others in the support group to do the same. You can also look to see if there is, in a lot of states, right, there's a Brain Injury Advisory Council.
And another thing with the legislators that I encourage people, even if it's a need of your own, you can still make appointment and talk of it, because the chances of your need is going to be just not with you, with other people.
Yes.
And that starts the ball rolling too. Like, I mean, I did that. And when I had the meetings with the legislator, this is something I learned, is you always start something with positive. That, and our inspector, he was a wonderful senator from Pennsylvania. And he told me that, he's like, that's why I listen to you, because you start with something positive and just don't go into it.
Really good at, yeah,
It's very, to get their attention, you know, and like that's a big starting place. And I mean, I've met with several legislators through the years, and some of them you can talk to, you're blue in your face, and they may don't think they're listening, but you don't know. And some people, you're not going to be able to change their opinion, but having your voice heard is an important part, because at least they know that there's people that this affects and they want change.
Right. And so being able to, the other kind of piece of that whole research part is I always tell folks, the other art of this is being able to tell your story that hits on all the important issues without going on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the balancing act. If you can do it in 2 minutes, tell your story, and then get to how that connects to what you're asking for, that can make a big difference. And that's not easy to do.
No.
It is not easy. I mean, anybody, if they're asked to tell their life story in 2 minutes, would struggle with what are the things
that's
I
where
really...
the talking points are important.
Mm-hmm.
Have talking points of what the main things that your needs or other people's needs are, just the main talking points.
Right.
And often what shocked me is they will ask questions too. So like they'll ask, well, what would be the better outcome if this were changed? And they'll ask questions and just, you know, and if it's something you still don't know yet about funding, tell them I'll research it and respond to you.
Someone had asked if there's any grants that help fund this work.
The Centers for Independent Living have grants.
I always try to find organizations that are already doing this.
Right.
And they don't necessarily need to be, so it might be the Brain Injury Association in your state. It might be the Center for Independent Living. It might be your disability rights office in your state. So look around, contact folks, ask what they're advocating for, because there's certainly other groups.
And another thing is some of the Center for Independent Living, like we're saying, they're all different. But there's some, if you get involved, like I was reimbursed for my transportation to go to.
Right. They may have some
to the Capitol, whatever. They may have fundings for that. So that's another way to look at it, because I know I don't drive. So that was a difficult thing for me. And, you know, I got reimbursed for things like that. And that was really helpful too.
Right. Yes. So it can vary a lot state to state on who might be doing the advocacy, what might be available, what support might be available. So I wish I had a better answer than really kind of look around to see what might be available in your state. Like I said, there's a lot of organizations that are already looking to kind of improve services or care. And so if you can find that work already done and support it, it helps. The more unified the message. So you might be one person that's supporting something, some legislative in your state, but there might be a dozen other folks that are meeting with their, and all of a sudden you get 12 people asking legislators at different points in time for the same thing around the same issue. all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, this might be a bigger, like you had said, every person that comes into the legislature, they're assuming other folks beyond this person are impacted by it.
And that's where statistics, like you can do some research, like how many people in your state are on like this
Mhm.
particular program, like the brain injury waiver or the long-term care services that have a brain injury. And sometimes I've known advocates to send out a survey monkey, which is simple to do online and just, or just put it on Facebook. Hey, what issues do you think need addressed? And that helps with that too, as well.
Yeah, any info, any insight about what folks are experiencing as a result can be helpful in advocating for improved services and funding. Um, yeah, someone else had asked about how do you advocate for insurance reform for long-term illness?
I'm sorry.
How do you advocate for insurance reform for long-term illnesses?
That's that has a lot of steps. That's because insurance reform is something that people have been fighting for years, and it's still a fight every day. Um, like for example, like what I talked about is like the earned income limit. That was a fight for a long time. And the other thing we're seeing a lot now is that the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services have their guidelines.
Mhm.
And that's something you might want to look into too. You go to CMS and look up Medicare and Medicaid guidelines because a lot of the private insurance are going by what CMS also states.
Yep.
Um, and that's another thing where, when we're always fighting with the insurance companies, it's bringing in the statistics, it's bringing in the outcomes. Like, for example, like some states for the brain injury programs in their states have limited time. And that's one thing with the insurances, like when you turn a certain age, then and then you have to switch to another program. But the long with insurances, it's one is looking at the CMS guidelines and then looking at because and it's advocating in your state too, because even Medicaid and private insurances, that's what people don't understand. Every state, even with the Medicare Advantage plans, each state is different. The CMS does the guidelines, but even private insurances, the rules are different in each state.
Yeah,
And
that's a good
that's where the state insurance department is a place that you can contact too.
point.
The one that does the medical appeals to find out a little more information on that. Did I answer the question?
I think so. I think, like you said, it's a lot to unpack, and I think when people talk about insurance reform for long term illness, one challenge is, of course, any private insurance they have limits to care, right? There's a cap to how many services you can get in a year, and so when you're talking long term services, there's some of it that you're bumping up against just what insurance will pay for,
Right.
right?
And that, I mean, and that's where it comes to the committees. Like, for example, in Pennsylvania and Kansas and Missouri and a couple other states, they have a home and community based services committee under the legislators.
Mhm.
And then they contacting them is also a really important key, like with the facts, with the numbers saying, hey, look at this limit. And for the average, like for Medicare, it's usually 18 to 21 days. And that number comes from Medicare.
Yep.
But that's what people, where they get lost. Where are these coming from? And that's why sharing the stories and calling the state insurance departments with the needs is a really important key in that too. It may not fix the problem, but it'll make it aware. And that's what I try to tell people. Like when you're doing the advocacy, you may not get it fixed, but at least you're making the other people aware of what the issues are in the
Yes.
system and what the issues are, even with your own situation. So it's bringing openness to it.
Yeah.
And that's a really important part of it.
Yeah. I always tell folks that it's kind of like voting. You feel like your vote all by itself doesn't really make a difference. but it does. The act of going out and voting or talking to other people, like it's the same idea of that collective sharing of how a policy or program impacts day to day, what happens day to day, and how folks are struggling. Like collectively, that can make a difference. Because it's not a quick thing, but it's important to do because it's not without it, it won't change.
Right. And like every voice does count. Like I said, it just sometimes you get frustrated. I mean, to be honest, there's times I get frustrated with the people that are making the rules and decisions, but sometimes afterwards I'm like, at least I let them know, at least we are making our voices heard. And um that's where the education comes into in a huge part too, is because they may not know, like if I have a friend that is in the legislature, and before he was running, I made him aware of what the home and community-based services were, what the brain injury program, what the insurance is. And sometimes just educating them is a huge key to that. That way they can learn more about it.
That's a really good point. Is that a lot of times they're not even fully aware of kind of how these programs work or operate or what the limitations are that they have. So kind of educating folks about the good and the bad of it, can help kind of set the table for if you're going to be asking for improvements to it. They have some basic understanding. So wish we had like some great little wrap up, story or something to share on advocacy, but it's an ongoing effort.
It is. And like, look at all those people with Americans with Disabilities Act. They all, I mean, it got to the extreme. They would have sit-ins and everything. And Judy Heumann just passed away, and she was huge with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I met her on several occasions, and it was incredible when you bring so many voices together to make a point. They have to listen.
Yes.
And it's like and that was the ADA, that was the beginning, but then you had to go through the fight to get the accommodations necessary.
Yeah.
So it's like, but getting a starting point is what I tell other people. Start with a small goal sometimes. Just like, I want my voice heard. These are the things that need to done. And when you start with something small, then you can build it up higher and higher.
That's a really good idea. That doesn't feel so overwhelming.
Right.
It's something easier to focus on. I think that's a good place to end. Start something small, build on that. Reach out to the organizations in your state to find out what avenues there are to help get support for your advocacy. What advocacy are already being done that you might join in. Certainly, you're always welcome to reach out to the Brain Injury Association of America. If you're looking to try to figure out where to find stuff in your state, reach out to us, let us know. We can help direct you. Try to find support groups in your state, other folks that might be interested in supporting or also being advocates, because every voice does count.
It does. And it's just they prefer to hear from the people. A lot of them do on the committees, rather than the ones making the decisions, because they're the ones. It doesn't seem that way sometimes, but what I've learned through the years is the people that are living it and that are affected by it, their voice a lot of times, it seems like it's not getting listened to, but in the end it does, because you are starting to see the changes, and that started from a few people just trying to make their needs known, and then it blossoms from there.
I agree with that 100%. Those folks who are living it, those words have weight. Mm-hmm. That's just credibility that cannot be bought anywhere. So you may not think it does, but it does have weight. Well, we hope everybody found this helpful. Again, folks are more than welcome to give us a call, contact us the Brain Injury Association of America if you're looking for help trying to get started in advocacy in ways big and small, both at the federal level as well as locally. Every voice does count. So I'd encourage you to figure out a way that works for you to try to lend your voice to improve the services and supports that should be available to folks with brain injury across the country. Thank you, everybody. Have a safe day. Happy first full day of spring.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.